All right, you ready? Yeah, awesome. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rebecca, and we are here today to talk about asylum applications. Good morning to all of our friends online. There are about 65 people joining us from Zoom. So welcome, good morning. A couple of things that I want to say before beginning. Number one, this presentation is being recorded. So our friends online, we're not seeing your faces. That's intentional. When we publish this on our website, on YouTube, we want to protect your privacy. We don't want to have your faces being seen. For our friends here in the room, your faces are not being captured. So the camera is only on me. So you don't have to worry that somehow your identity is going to be shared. As is very obvious, we are having a bilingual presentation, English and Spanish. For those of you who speak Spanish, if you ever have a question that you want to ask, feel free to do it in Spanish, and I will repeat the question in English for our friends who are online and for the other people who are here in the room, okay? But I'm gonna be keeping my eye on the interpreters in case I'm talking too fast or I need to slow down for any reason whatsoever. I'm going to be communicating with them to make sure that it's all going well. Okay? Wonderful. So again, welcome. We're so happy to be here. And thank you to our partners at MASA for hosting us in this beautiful room. It's so lovely here. The sun is shining. It's spring. It's great. We're very happy to be here. All right. Sorry, I'm gonna move my screen. What's happening? There we go. I'm gonna begin by explaining what we're going to do today, the agenda. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am and why you should believe anything that I have to say about asylum applications. I'm going to talk just very briefly about the work that we're doing, that Unlocal is doing with MASA and other partners. We're going to spend a little bit of time, actually a lot of time, talking about asylum law, because it's really important that you understand a little bit about asylum law when you're figuring out how to fill out these applications. After talking about asylum law, we're going to look at the application. And for our friends here, I hope you have a hard copy of it. If you don't, we can get you one. For our friends online, I'm going to ask you to access it online when it comes to that point. After we look at the application, and after we feel like, okay, we got it, we understand how to fill it out, we're going to talk about then what happens. What do we do next? Now I have my application filled out. Where do I send it? What do I do next? We're also going to spend, I did put it on the agenda, but we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what it means to be supporting people who are seeking asylum, what that means in terms of the authorized or unauthorized practice of law, and just a whole host of other issues. We're going to talk about that for a little bit. And of course, there's going to be time for questions. My hope is that I don't talk for more than 1 hour so that we have half an hour for questions. I can't ever guarantee that. There's a lot to say about this area of the law. It's hard to, rein myself in. I do want to say, while I'm talking, if you have a question, please ask it. That goes for the people online as well as the people here. I find that these presentations are much more meaningful if people ask questions, because I don't think of everything, right? I'm not necessarily thinking about what information that am I not giving, right? So please don't be shy. If you have the question, somebody else also has it. And for our colleagues online, we will be monitoring the Q&A. There are a lot of people online. We may not get to all of your questions. In fact, we probably won't get to all of your questions, but we'll do our very best to keep an eye on it and to answer the most relevant ones. There's a few of us here today who are monitoring the Q&A, and please interrupt me, colleagues, if you see a question that you think is really relevant. All right. Awesome. So we're good with the agenda. Briefly, who am I? My name is Rebecca Press. I have been an immigration lawyer for 14 years. The vast majority of my experience is working with people seeking asylum who are in immigration court. They are defending their asylum case before an immigration judge. The vast majority of my work has been with Central and South Americans. I am also the legal director of a wonderful organization called Unlocal, where we have a legal team that provides representation to immigrants in New York, as well as an education team that is deeply committed to providing access to information to New York's immigrant communities. So I feel like 14 years is a lot, and I have a lot of experience doing it. But I'm always learning something new, right? So I have some expertise, but there's always more to learn. And what is the Pro Se Plus project? It is a collaboration of the organizations that you see here, including MASA and Unlocal. And it was born out of this recognition. As many of you know, thousands and thousands of migrants have arrived in New York in the last year. But even before all those people arrived, we had very, very large immigrant communities in New York. Of course, that's like one of the most amazing things about New York. Many of whom don't have access to good legal information. Out of the recognition that not everyone is going to get to talk to a reputable attorney or a reputable organization, these organizations came together and created a project in an attempt to bring the information to the people, right? We know a lot of things, people need the information, so we're trying to bridge that gap. And of course, also take cases and talk with people, see how we can best assist them. But today, we're really focusing on helping educate people who either have their own cases or are supporting people who have their cases. So that's just a tiny little bit on PSC. Okay. So let's go. You ready? We're going to talk about asylum law. Asylum law. Why am I beginning with asylum law? You have to understand at least a little bit about asylum law to be able to complete the application in a compelling and like legally compelling way. So we're going to talk about it for a little bit. At its most basic, what is asylum? Asylum is humanitarian protection for those who have been persecuted or will be persecuted in their country of birth. It is in and of itself a legal and permanent status. In and of itself, you can have asylum. If you are granted asylum, you can have that status for the rest of your life. It is also a pathway to a green card. So if you get asylum, you can then apply for a green card and eventually citizenship. So in terms of immigration, there are huge benefits to being granted asylum. Every single person who is legitimately afraid to return to their country of birth has the right to seek asylum. It does not matter why you are afraid. It does matter in the ultimate decision, but just the mere fact of legitimately and sincerely being afraid to return gives you the right to seek asylum. And once you do that, the US government they must review your application and say, you do apply, or I'm sorry, you do qualify or you don't, right? So why you seek asylum is important to the ultimate decision, but it is not important to whether or not you have the right to apply. Okay. So we're going to dig into these eligibility requirements. I do want to say, though, it's occurring to me, I don't mean to suggest that after our 90 minutes together, anyone is going to feel like an expert in asylum law, right? It is, in fact, a complicated and nuanced area of the law. I have been doing it for 14 years. I review things every single time. Every single time I'm doing a case, I review the law. And I figure out how can I best use it for my client, right? That said, you are all perfectly capable of understanding the nuance and the complexity. Today is a beginning. And for some people who have already been exposed to this, it's a refresher, right? And that's fine. felt the need to say, we're not going to be experts after 90 minutes, right? But we are going to have a much better understanding of the requirement. So number one, I'm starting with a procedural requirement. Number one, you must formally seek asylum. That means submit your application within 1 year of arrival. Most people probably know that, but it's incredibly, incredibly important, because if you don't, you are automatically ineligible for asylum. So it's really, really, really critical that all of us supporting people who are seeking asylum help them do that within 1 year of arrival. There are exceptions to the rule, but you don't even want to get there. You don't even want to have to show that you are eligible for an exception. Okay. Number two, asylum requires demonstrating that you have suffered persecution in the past or will suffer it in the future. Persecution is a legal term of art, and what it means is serious physical or psychological harm, or both. Not every kind of harm is persecution, right? Well, maybe not right, but not every kind of harm is persecution. Some examples of serious harm would be things that seem pretty obvious, right? Sexual assault, physical assault, attempted murder, right? These things are serious kinds of physical harm that are sufficient enough to be persecution. But what about less obvious things? For example, death threats. In some places, death threats are enough to be serious enough to be persecution. When I say in some places, I mean in some parts of the United States, and that depends on which federal court hears the case. In New York, death threats might be enough, but they're not always enough. So it's important to talk about death threats in a serious way, in a way where the person reading your application knows, oh, this was really serious. This person really believed this death threat. They really thought that they were going to be killed. What is not persecution? Anything that can be described as discrimination or harassment. So when you're listening to people, or when you're thinking about it yourself, you want to make sure I'm not minimizing what happened to me or what I think will happen to me in the future. You want to make sure that you're being really real about it, right? This thing that happened to me was awful, or this thing that will happen in the future is going to be really terrible. Do not try to minimize it. That actually will work against you. Okay. Second component, or really second substantive component, no, you can go back, sorry, is about government involvement. Asylum requires that the people doing the harm, the serious harm, are either government actors or people that the government cannot or will not control. There has to be government connection. Otherwise, it's not persecution. As I said, persecution is a legal term of art, which means it has a very specific definition, which we know includes serious harm, and now we know includes a government component to it. It doesn't mean that the person who hurt you has to be a government official, but it does mean you have to explain why you think the government wouldn't have been able to protect you or won't be able to protect you in the future. And finally, and maybe the hardest, is we have to demonstrate that the harm, the persecution, is, quote, on account of a protected characteristic. This is the aspect of the law that can get really complicated, but it's worth talking about, and it's certainly understandable. I think you are one ahead of me. Yeah, there you go. Awesome. Okay. So what are the protected characteristics? They're the 5 categories listed here. This means that our responsibility as people supporting people seeking asylum, or people seeking asylum themselves, have to make the connection between whatever they experienced in the past, what they're going to experience in the future, and one or more of these 5 categories. And certainly it can be more than one. It does not have to be exclusively one, right? Many, many people have more than one reason for being afraid. And I see people taking notes, and I failed to mention that we actually have QR codes that will bring up the presentation if anybody wants to have the presentation on their screen at the same time. So a fairly common example of people having more than one category, a fairly common example that we see in our work, are people who have both been politically active and who are members of the queer community. There is no reason, if they have suffered harm or think that they will in the future, because of both of those things, you don't just choose one, right? You choose both. You choose both. Another example, I'm referring to the category called social group. This is sort of a bigger, broader category than the other 4. And here I've written some examples of what could constitute a social group. If you're a member of the queer community, if your family has been targeted, your family group is a social group. In many, many places where gender-based violence is sort of entrenched into society, we can make gender-based claims that fit into the social group category. So persecution requires a serious level of harm, government involvement, and it's because of one or more of these characteristics, right? So you want to be thinking about that when you're thinking about the form, and when you're talking to people about why are they seeking asylum, you want to be thinking about these eligibility requirements. One thing that I do want to mention that I didn't put in the slide, I don't want to give the impression that I don't want to give the impression that you have to prove 100% that this happened because of this reason. That is not what you have to prove. In fact, in order to show that you're eligible for asylum, you only have to prove 10%, a 10% chance. That's a very low probability. What that means is if I'm standing here with 9 other people and I can show that one of them, just like me, is going to be persecuted, I too should be eligible for asylum, right? So it's you don't have to be thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to show 100% that this is going to happen to me, or that this is why it happened to me before? It's just a 10% likelihood. I stress that because often the judges who are listening to cases, they forget that, right? And they want to hear, oh no, but it's, 50% or more. That's not what you have to show. And we should be reminding them that that's not what they have to show. Also really important is just this point that you have to, although anyone who is afraid can seek asylum, not everyone is eligible, right? And so you want to be using these eligibility requirements to help explain why the person is eligible. It's not, you can't just say, well, there's a lot of really extreme, terrible poverty where I came from, or even really extreme, terrible violence. You need to connect it to your own personal circumstances. All right. Any questions? Good. All right. I want to spend a second talking about procedure before we go into the application, because vocabulary matters, and we're going to be talking about affirmative applications and defensive applications, and I want to make sure everybody knows what we're talking about, okay? So as I said, everyone who's here who is afraid has the right to apply for asylum. But how do you do that? It depends. If you are someone who has a case in the immigration court, you submit your application with the immigration judge. That's called a quote defensive application. If you don't have a case with an immigration judge, then you seek asylum affirmatively. You go to the immigration agency called USCIS and you say, hey, I want to seek asylum. How do you figure out If you have a case or if someone you're supporting has a case, you call this 1-800 number that's on the screen, or you visit the website that's there and you put in your A number or the person's A number. And if it says, oh, the system shows your name is PRESF, my last name, right? Then, okay, then that means I'm in the system. I'm in the immigration court system, and that I have to file my application with immigration court. If it says there is no A number associated with that number, then it means I'm not in immigration court and I have to file affirmatively. So that's a key step when figuring out how am I supporting this person, or how am I applying myself? Sorry, not moving. Awesome. Okay. So we are about to dive into the actual application. This is when I'm going to ask the folks online to please open the application. But I'm going to type the website into the chat so everyone can just click on it. Please open it on your computer so that you have it while we are talking. And for the folks here, I think everybody has the copy in front of them, which is great. A couple of things before we really dive in. As the website is right there, which is where it's available to all. Number one, the application has to be completed and submitted in English, but the application is available in lots of languages. It's available in Spanish, it's available in French, it's available in many, many more languages. I sincerely recommend that people first fill it out in their best language. Why? Because it's critical that you understand what is the application asking and how am I going to answer it, right? And that you're able to do that in your best language. You can then take your answers and rewrite them in the English version and with English translation. But at least the place to begin is studying the application in your best language. Okay. So, as we know, this is the application, okay? This is the application. This might seem very obvious. The entire application must be true. You cannot lie about anything. You cannot help anyone lie about anything. This does not mean you have to include every single detail, but it does mean that every single thing included must be true. We will talk about why later, but it can have extraordinarily serious consequences if you lie or if somebody else lies on their application. So everything must be true. That's probably obvious, but I wanted to say it. The first 4 pages are basically purely biographical pages. We're going to go into them, but they're purely biographical, and it's on page 5 where the more substantive questions begin. Why are you afraid to go back? The first thing I want to say is on page 1, you guys will see it starts with this note at the very top. It says, check this box if you want to apply for protection under the Convention Against Torture. Check that box, mark that box, okay? The Convention Against Torture is a related form of humanitarian protection, which we're not going to talk about today, okay? But the immigration judge needs to see that you've marked that box in order to consider that application. Super easy, also super easy to forget. So just mark it, make sure you mark it. Yeah. Sorry, I think, yeah, here we go. So we're going to talk a little bit about certain questions that can give people trouble. Question 7 about gender. I have included this tip because we work with a lot of transgender applicants. The reality is that we are still pretty antiquated in the federal system, and transgender applicants who have not legally changed their names have to write their legal name in parts 4 through 6. Part 7 is where they can list their actual name, right? But if their legal name has not been changed, it is their legal name that has to be included in parts 4 through 6. Questions 8 and 9 are about addresses. It is really, really, really important that there is an address where people can receive mail. If the person you're working with says, I don't trust where I receive mail, I don't trust where I live to receive mail, then you want to include a mailing address. And that can be a variety of places, right? Maybe they have a family member who has a safer address. Maybe your office is the place that can receive mail for them. But you need to include both where they physically reside, as well as a safe mailing address. Okay, question 11, also on page 1, marital status. We work with a lot of people who have been in a long-term relationship for a long time and are in a committed relationship. If they are not legally married, you have to put single, right? You have to put single, which is okay, you know, that's fine. It's just their legal relationship to be. Question 14, dual nationality. I have spoken to a lot of people from Venezuela who have dual nationality. They are citizens of both Colombia and Venezuela, for example. Just do not assume that someone is not a dual national. You have to ask. It shouldn't prejudice their case, the fact that they have dual citizenship. And then question 18 on page 1, this can trip people up a little bit. This goes back to our conversation about defensive versus affirmative. Remember I said, how do you figure out if you file your application with the immigration court or not? That's by calling the 1-800 number or checking the website. That's also how you figure out how to answer this question. If somebody has an active case in immigration court or any case at all, then you mark B, so you like Bob. Right, because they're in immigration proceeding. That's what that means. Okay. Any questions about page 1? That's pretty good. Okay. Okay. Oh, actually, we're still on page 1. That's a lot of information. So, question 19. People don't often remember the exact date that they left their country, right? It can be hard to remember that. One sort of avenue to explore is, well, how long did your trip to the United States take? Another really important thing, sometimes, I'm not sure why, but there can be confusion when you ask, when did you enter the US? There can be confusion. Does that mean when I actually crossed the border? Or does that mean when I got to New York? It means when did you step foot in US territories, right? It doesn't mean when did you get to New York. It means when did you cross the border. So that's the date of entry that you're looking for. And that's the date of entry that's key for the 1-year filing deadline. If someone got to New York July of 2022, but crossed the border in May of 2022, their 1-year filing deadline is much closer, right? Because we're in April already. So you really need to know when did they actually cross into US territory. Okay. Pages 2 and 3 are all about spouse and children. And really there are only a couple of things that can be complicated about this part. It's pretty self-explanatory. One complicated question is below the boxes where you list the information, it asks you, do you want to include this person in the application? How do you answer that question? If the family unit has a case together, whether that's with the immigration court or affirmatively, then the answer is yes. If the family unit does not have a case together, so let's say I have a case with the immigration court, but my spouse doesn't, and he has to do the affirmative application with USCIS. I can't mark yes to that question because the judge doesn't have any power to grant him asylum because he's in a totally different situation than I am. That's at the end of the story, right? There's more to do, but it's just in terms of how to fill out the form. People who are outside of the country, you also don't mark yes, you can just leave it blank. So if your children or your spouse are outside of the country, you can leave it blank. Children, all children have to be listed here. If you have 6 kids and 4 of them are over 18, you still list them here. Stepchildren are also listed. Stepchildren means you are legally married to the parent, and that marriage happened before they turned 18. They're listed here. Kids are not listed if it's an informal relationship. So that same stat, I've been with my partner for 20 years, but we never got married. I raised his biological son, but we never formalized our relationship. That person is not legally my child, right? And so that person is not included in this section of the application. Question. Okay, page 4. This is a monster of a page. It asks for a lot of information, And one tip I would have for people supporting asylum applicants is to ask them to take a stab at this themselves, right? People know this information. It's not too difficult. And at least like to get it going or to get the juices flowing to spark some memory about where you lived, when you lived there, where you worked, school. It's quite a beast of a page. It's also a really important page to get to know people. You get to know a lot about the people you're working with through this page. Oh, you went to university? Tell me about that. What were you studying? How come you left in 2021? What was going on? Oh, you went to high school in a different part of the country? Welcome. Right? It's a page that you can use to get to know the person that you're supporting. It's also, it can help you fill in maybe gaps. Like if you spent a lot of time talking to people about what happened that led them to leave their country and that led them to the United States, it can help you fill in the timeline of their life through this page. So use it like that, right? There can be some sort of circular talking about what happened, or maybe you're not getting all the details. You feel like you don't really understand what happened. This page can help you access that in a way that's less sensitive, to be honest, right? Let's go through your educational history. Let's go through your job history. It's not as sensitive as tell me about that time that terrible thing happened to you, right? So it's a way to get to know people in a gentler way, I think. The other thing is you want to compare what's on this page with the narrative that you will ultimately write, because they all have to match up, right? If somebody says, oh, I left my home in 2020, but then it shows that they graduated from college in 2021, you want to understand that. Like, tell me more about that. How did that happen? And maybe it's, oh, I graduated virtually, and so I was able to do that. But you want to just make sure that anything that could look like, oh, how this isn't matching up, that it makes sense to you, and you help them figure out also how to explain it. Okay, so we're finally getting to the substance of the application. Okay, so as you see on page 5, this is where you would select the protected ground or grounds that you think you're eligible for asylum under, or that the person you're helping is eligible for, and where you would write a summary of why you're seeking asylum. I cannot stress this enough. Please only write a summary. You do not, nor should you, have to include every single detail in this application. You will have an opportunity later to provide more detail. anything that is said in this application essentially locks the person in to the information. So if a mistake is made or a detail is not correct for some reason, that can have really serious consequence later. So write a summary, okay, and say affirmatively, this is a summary, right? This is a summary. And I will provide a more detailed statement in the future. That does not prejudice anyone. It does not hurt anyone for any reason. And in fact, doing the opposite is what can hurt people in the future. This is especially true if you are not communicating with people in the language that they speak best. If you are communicating with people in a different language, and maybe you have different interpreters each time, maybe you're rushed each time, a lot gets lost in translation. Even if you are spending a lot of time getting to know somebody's history, why they're seeking asylum, you can take all of that and help them write a summary, right? You are going to be including much less information than you actually know about the person in the summary, but you're doing it for their benefit. Some specific recommendations. Avoid specific details like dates, colors, or quantities. Unless you have a very, very good reason for remembering that on March 3rd, 2022, something happened to you, you can just say in March of 2022. Sometimes people have really good reasons. Sometimes, oh, that's my birthday, so I'll never forget that day. Or that's my anniversary, right? Or that's a national holiday in my country, right? So they remember why, and they have a reason for remembering that. But unless you have a reason like that, I urge you to take out that specific detail because it doesn't prejudice them or you, but it could prejudice you in the future if you forget or fictional. So here's an example. Instead of on March 3rd, 2022, 4 people in a green van followed me, you say in March 2022, some people in a vehicle. I've taken out the specific date, I've taken out the number of people, and I've taken out the color. I've also taken out that it was a van, right? It just says vehicle. That is a sufficient level of detail for the application. Okay. Just going to say again, always write, this is a summary of what I experienced, and I will provide a more detailed statement in the future. Because that also helps if in the future the judge says, why wasn't this included in your asylum application? You can say, well, Your Honor, I specifically wrote that it was a summary, right? So it protects you a little bit from having to include all of the details. I want to do some examples so that you can see this in real life. Sorry, I don't have this. Oh, they found out in Spanish over there. This is a real example. This example written here fit into this box. It did not go onto another page. It fit into this box. So anyone want to read it out loud so I can stop talking for a sec? Go for it, Jessica.
This is a summary. I will provide a more detailed statement in the future. I was a member of the opposition political party, blank, for many years. I regularly attended meetings and supported the party in many ways, including going to marches, participating in conversations about what different sectors needed, helping in elections. This is not an exhaustive list. In November 2021, we had elections. That day, members of the colectivos, the opposition or government-backed paramilitary group, approached us at the polling place and started shooting at us with automatic weapons. Multiple people were killed immediately, and many more of us were kidnapped. They told me that they were going to kill me. They said they know who I was, that I was an opponent to the government. Sometime in the early morning of the next day, I was thrown off a motorcycle in the middle of a road, and a car passed by and rescued me. Many other things happened to me that I will detail in a written statement.
That was everything that I included in my client's asylum application. It covered some really important details and also wasn't overly detailed, right? I don't think I talked about how many people, or exactly what time of day, or what people were wearing, right? All of those details are important details and will probably come out when we do the trial. And he gives testimony, and will even come out when I sit with him and we write a longer statement. But for the asylum application itself, it's not necessary to include all of those details. Okay, these are some examples of even shorter answers. I have some colleagues who think you should only write 2 or 3 sentences, right, out of an asylum application. These are some examples to help you think about how to really summarize. This is a brief summary. I will provide a more detailed statement in the future. I'm going to repeat that 1,000,000 times so that you never forget it. I suffered several acts of physical and psychological violence and death threats by X group because of my opposition to the government, and then I fled. Or I suffered several violent and sexual attacks because of my queer identity. Right? You're really summarizing the case to its core. And the other thing I would add, especially for the folks in this room, if you are preparing an application without the benefit of an attorney, in addition to this is a summary, you can say, I'm preparing this application without a lawyer, right? And that also provides more reason why you would provide a very brief summary. What questions are answered by the examples that we just went through? All of the questions that get to asylum eligibility. Who did the harm? Government actors? What happened? Was it serious enough to be persecution? Why? What motivated the people who were harming me? Right? Was it because of a protected ground? When, more or less? How did they do it? And where? Just a teeny bit about in the shorter examples, we didn't even do where. Part of what we're doing is helping people think about how to present their narrative in a way that makes sense to a highly educated person from the United States. And people from the US think about things, who, what, why, when, how, where. That's not necessarily true in other places, right? But it is true here. And so we want to help people answer these questions, but briefly, very briefly. Sorry. Okay. Why do I keep saying that you should only write a summary? And that you should say a more detailed statement will be provided in the future. Number 1, credibility. Credibility means, does the judge believe you? Or does the asylum officer believe you? That is, we didn't talk about this earlier, but truly, credibility is the most important part of an asylum case. The person with the power to say yes or no has to believe what you're saying, right? So if you include too many details and later you forget them, that can cause that person to question whether you're telling the truth. So don't set people up for that failure, right? Write a summary, later on they'll provide more details. Memory fails and changes. This is a very long process. Between the time you apply for asylum and the time you have a decision, years could pass, literally years. People spend a lot of time trying not to think about what happened to them, right? 4 or 5 years from now, are they going to recall that it was a green van? Maybe, also maybe not. So don't include details that can trip people up unnecessarily. I mentioned before translation. We have seen this a lot where very well-intentioned people spent a long time writing very detailed affidavits, but they did not speak the language of the person they were helping. And a lot gets messed up in interpretation if it's not done well. It can be done very, very well. But we have seen many examples where different interpreters were used, or they were engaging with different people, and somehow things got misinterpreted or just messed up, frankly, in the interpretation. legal representation in the future. It in fact makes my job harder if you have written a 4-page or a 6-page or a 10-page affidavit with someone. I would much rather a summary of their claim, and then I'm the one who, digs into what happened with the person, right? Because of these credibility issues, right? Once you write down on the asylum application what happened, yes, we can correct it. It can still hurt their credibility. And again, people always have the opportunity to provide more details. So we don't have to lock them into details too soon. Oh, there were a couple other things I wanted to say about the application, which I forgot to include. Okay. My apologies, I don't have a slide on this because, to be honest, I thought about it this morning on the subway while I was here. So I'm going to just highlight a couple of other questions that can trip people up a little bit. On page 6, frankly, pages 6 through 9 are pretty self-explanatory, but there are a couple of questions that might require additional information. So just like I've been saying, please only write a summary for why are you seeking asylum. I'm also going to say, please only write a summary for any of the other questions that need an explanation. For example, the first question on page 6 asks about criminal history. Has the applicant ever been arrested or detained for any reason whatsoever outside of the United States? People can be really nervous about answering this question, yes. But number one, if the answer is yes, they have to say yes, right? Because they have to tell the truth. And number 2, you can help them write a statement that says, I was arrested in this month and this year. I will provide more information later, right? I'm filling this out without an attorney. I will provide more information later. You're answering the question honestly, right? But you're not doing anything that could potentially harm the person, right? And that it's much, much better than lying, right? You should not say no if you have in fact been arrested. Let's see. Okay, also on page 6, the last question, are you afraid of being tortured in your home country? That relates back to where we started, that box on the first page. Do you want to seek protection under the Convention Against Torture? In that box, you can simply refer back to the summary for asylum because they're very, very interconnected. Okay, but sometimes people don't know how to answer that question. Any questions?
Yes, can you give us an example, then how would you answer that?
That the one about torture?
Yes.
Yeah, I think you could say something like, please see my answer to question 1 on page 5. Yeah.
I have a question coming in from online. If you were detained at the border, do you say yes to were you ever arrested?
Yes, but not to that question. There's another question on on page 8, question 6. Have you or a family member ever blah, 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 been arrested, charged, convicted for any crime, including for an immigration law violation? So here, if you were arrested at the border, you would say yes, and you would say, I was arrested at the US border when I was trying to seek asylum, or something like that. There's no reason to say no to that question. Everybody knows you were arrested at the border. It doesn't prejudice you in any way. But yeah, you would say yes. Great. I'm gonna move to the administrative process unless folks have questions about the actual. Okay. So now you filled out the application, it's all true, you've only written a summary, you're ready to file it. How the heck do you file the asylum application? I swear it changes every day, but for right now, this is our best advice. For folks who are applying affirmatively, so they are not in immigration court, they don't have any immigration court proceeding. One amazing advantage they have is that they can file online, right? They can file online, which is great. It's super simple, but it's available. And if you file online, you immediately get a receipt number or confirmation that the application has been received. So that's cool because if you file by paper, it can take 4 to 6 months just to get a notice from immigration that your application has been received. If you do file a paper copy, you have to file an original application for the applicant plus 1 copy, and then 1 additional copy for each family member who's been included, and passport photos. And for residents of New York, I know that we have some colleagues online joining us from New Hampshire. I do not know where people in New Hampshire file. For residents of New York, they file in California now. Okay. Now, the defensive application. So people who do have an immigration court proceeding, the application cannot be filed online, unfortunately, and must be filed with the court that has jurisdiction. What that means is the court that has the power to hear their case. So if I'm in New York, but I have to show up in San Antonio to a court date, not an ICE check-in, a court date, then San Antonio is the court where I have to file my application. That said, hopefully we can get their court changed to New York, right? So that they can file here. But until that happens, it's San Antonio where I have to file my case. And the way, how do you find out which court has jurisdiction? It's that same 800 number or the same website. And it says your next hearing is scheduled for San Antonio, Texas on whatever date. That's how you know. Wherever the system says your case is happening, that's where you file. Also, passport photo, identity documents. This question about copies for derivatives, what that means is, should I include a copy for my spouse and my children who are included? It's actually different from in the affirmative process, you have to include copies. In the defensive process, you don't. They will be included anyway. You would include copies for them only if you think they have what's called an independent claim. So separate from my claim, they're also eligible for asylum. You would file, frankly, a separate application for them. And sometimes we file copies for derivatives if we think that the person is really eligible for protection under the Convention Against Torture rather than asylum. Because if I'm granted asylum, my spouse and kids are also granted asylum. But if I'm granted what's called cat relief, my spouse and kids aren't necessarily granted. They have to have their own application. But for purposes of the 1-year filing deadline, for purposes of just getting the application in, you can file 1 application for the principal applicant, the person with the strongest claim, and his or her derivatives, his spouse, the children will be included in that application. Oh, we're going to talk about this on the next slide. But for those folks who are helping people file their applications with immigration court, you are now required to file a form called the EOIR 61. If you Google EOIR 61, this form will come up immediately. What this form is you are declaring to the immigration court that I have helped so-and-so prepare and file their application so that they know, okay, they didn't just do it on their own. I'm an attorney, right? If I'm going to take on a case, I'm going to represent a case, I file a different form saying, declaring to the court, I am this person's attorney. I can also file the EOIR 61 if I'm just helping someone, but I'm not taking the case form. So this is a form that's required for everyone, from a friend all the way to attorney, if you're simply helping someone file their case. Another difference between defensive applications and affirmative application. When you file affirmatively, the immigration agency will automatically send you a fingerprint appointment. Fingerprints is required for every single person who seeks asylum. Take your fingerprint, they take a photo of you, it's a background check. They want to know that the person is not any sort of danger to society. In the immigration court, in that lane, right on that path, you have to do that yourself, or the lawyers have to do that for their clients. We have to request a fingerprint appointment. So the way you do that is what's written on the screen here. You file your application with the immigration court, you keep a copy of it, of course, you always keep a copy. You take the first 3 pages of that application and you mail them to this address. This is a clickable link, but you can visit it later. There are instructions there that you have to include. And theoretically, immigration will send you an appointment notice for fingerprint. Doesn't always work, but that's what's supposed to happen. And it's our obligation to do that, or it's your obligation to do that for your own case. Okay. So what happens after we file the application? As I just said, most people will get a fingerprint notice. Both the trial and the asylum interview take a very, very, very long time to happen. People who are affirmative applicants have an asylum interview. It's not a trial. People who are in the immigration court have an actual trial. In both circumstances, you have the opportunity to present evidence, right? So you have filed this application, which only includes a summary, and you're thinking, but when do I prove my case? When do I tell everyone what happened and present all of my evidence? For people who are affirmative and having an interview, you usually present your evidence just 1 week before the interview, sometimes on the same day. And it's an interview, it's not a trial, right? You're just having a conversation with an asylum officer about why you are seeking asylum and why you think you should be able to stay in the United States. If the asylum officer says yes, then wonderful, you are granted asylum. If the asylum officer says no, then you are sent to immigration court where you have another chance to win your case. Most people that we're interacting with now are in immigration court proceedings, and so they're going to have a trial. You usually present your evidence either 15 or 30 days before the trial. Judge decides if the person is eligible. It is what we call an adversarial process. That means there's a prosecutor who cross-examines you or your client. But it is the judge who makes the decision. It is not the prosecutor. And if the judge decides that you don't qualify, you have the right to appeal. This process really does take a very long time. For a trial, it can be 2 to 3 years after you apply. For the affirmative folks, it can be 5 to 7 years before they have an interview. So it's a very, very, very long process. Yeah. Okay, I wanted to spend a second on the EOIR 61, which is the document that I mentioned briefly, that we have to file if we've helped someone complete their asylum application and file it in court. So the reason folks in this room and online with us are even able to file this form is because within immigration law, there is this oddity, there is something different where non-lawyers are in fact authorized to practice law. If you are, quote, a reputable person who is not charging, you cannot charge for your services, and you are a reputable person of good moral character, you are in fact authorized to practice immigration law, even though you're not a lawyer. It's weird, right? It's weird. It's a bizarre thing. And I want to sort of strongly say that I don't encourage it, right? Immigration law is in fact very complicated. And the fact that you are authorized to practice it doesn't mean that you should, right? Because you may not feel that you're an expert in the area. I actually don't know the history of why there's this exception, but there is. And so what that means is you can feel secure. Okay, I'm not doing something wrong here. Like I am I am able to use like all my skills and my knowledge of the systems and in English language to help people fill out their applications and file them. I'm not doing something wrong, but I would really advise against giving legal advice. Unless you feel that you have all the expertise you need to answer questions. We have talked a lot about the legal requirements. I'm not sure that anyone, I would still say that there are questions honestly better left to people who do have the legal experience to answer questions that require legal advice. Like some of the questions that I wrote on in the slides. If somebody ever asks you, should I say this or should I say that? Should I not say that I was arrested? How strong is my case? How will this affect me? All of these questions require knowledge of the law, right? And I would really, really urge you not to opine, right? Not to give your opinion on it. But you are so capable of helping people do the thing that is super duper important to their immigration case. So I don't want to discourage you from doing that. I also did want to mention, there is this weird thing in immigration law where non-lawyers are able to practice law. You do have to be a reputable person of good moral character, and you cannot charge. If you charge, or if you know of someone who is charging, they are in direct violation of New York state law, and they can and probably will be prosecuted. So please don't do that. All right. Well, I'm gonna stop talking. That's it for me. I hope people got some great information out of it. And I think we have, what time is it? We do have time for some questions if anyone has questions or if there are any questions online. I see this one about the E61. Online, somebody is asking, is EOIR 61 better than OPLA accredited representative? So this person is referring, I just said that non-lawyers are authorized to practice law. There are two categories of non-lawyers who can practice immigration law. One is the category of reputable individuals, and the other is the category of accredited representatives, which I'm sure many people have heard of. Accredited representatives are formally designated by the immigration agency to be able to practice law, and they have to do so with an accredited organization. So they're supervised by attorneys, and they can regularly take cases. They can go into immigration court every single day and represent people every single day. Reputable individuals, it has to be a rarity, right? You can't be showing up in court every day saying, here I am again, I'm a reputable individual. It has to be sort of a one-off or an occasional thing that you're doing. Better, I think accredited representatives have a lot of training, they have a lot of supervision. So in terms of direct representation, you definitely, like an accredited rep would be a much stronger representative. But we have a crisis of representation right now, and we need all hands on deck, really. We're getting more questions online.
I think we have one. Rebecca.
You can answer the ones here.
I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
If you touched on this, I apologize. My question was about 2B on the asylum application, where it asks about the countries that people pass through. So people have, in many cases, especially coming from Venezuela, they've done the land journey all the way across. So I'm just saying, having like worked with some folks to help fill this out, am I understanding correctly that they need to itemize every single country they pass through and then also state why they couldn't seek asylum or why they didn't seek asylum in those countries?
Yes, you are correct about that.
Okay, there's one more question. Okay, the second question is about torture, which is question 4. So, person formerly worked for high-level government law enforcement, had reason to believe that they were trying to kill them for things that they had helped prosecute in government. And so, you know, they're like their houses were burned down and things happened to them.
Yeah.
If there were attempts on their life, attempts on their property, and they were in high-level law enforcement with every reason to believe that the people that they worked with were trying to kill them. Does that meet the torture requirement, or is the torture requirement something different than that? I get that this is where we've kind of been hung up as a big fled because
Yeah,
they worked in government, and from their understanding, the people that they worked alongside were tasked with eliminating them for the things that they knew.
so I would say yes, definitely. Do you all recall that I was saying that the definition of persecution requires government involvement, right? It requires either that it happens by the government or by people that the government is unable or unwilling to control. Sure. Cat, protections for cats is a slightly different standard. So it requires either that it's happening by government actors or that the government is quote acquiescing to it, which is, you don't need to know this, but I was just
Yeah.
for, to like fully answer the question. It's a higher standard. In this case that you're talking about, if it's actual government actors who he thought was out to get him, then I think you have the required government component as well as the required level of harm.
Yeah,
Yeah, so I would say
And-
yeah.
I think that's sort of where we're waiting for immediate families to finally cross to join him. So my understanding is we wait to file this when family nucleus is united, that we're all persecuted, and then that's how that would be indicated here.
I would say the only exception to that is if you're approaching the 1-year filing deadline, if the family isn't here.
Okay, and that's when you're from the first person that's crossed in, yeah, the primary.
Everybody can have their own separate application, right? So if it turns out that his spouse and children all also qualify, and for some reason, you're worried that there's something in asylum law called the persecutor bar. If you're worried that he himself was a persecutor and his spouse and children wouldn't be eligible because of that, then you could file a separate application for that.
Thank you.
Emma, were you gonna say something?
Thank you. Given the representation crisis you just mentioned, if someone is not approaching the 1-year deadline, is it advised that they just go ahead and complete the 589? Or is it better for them to wait longer and continue trying to secure representation?
Maria, did you hear that? Did you? Yeah. I mean, that's a judgment call. The sooner you file your application, as I know you know, the sooner you're eligible for a work authorization card. We're gonna do another session on work authorizations, I think in June. But that is a reality, right? Like you file today, you're that much closer to getting your EAD. We want people to be as well informed as possible when they apply. And also in control of the decision about when, I really need this work authorization, so I'm gonna apply sooner. That's a perfectly acceptable choice to be making, right? I think it's really a judgment call and it will be different for different people.
I have a question coming in from online. What are the consequences for filing an EOIR 61 for the person who helped? Is there anything consequential?
Yeah, none that I am aware of. It's a very new form. I think within the last 2 months, I think they just issued it. So if there are consequences, we haven't seen them yet, but it's really just a declaration like I helped this person do this thing. You are not on the hook for anything. You are not saying that you represent the individual. It's, informing the court essentially of your existence and what you did in the case.
I have a follow-up. As a reputable person, is there a possibility you will be indicted if the applicant puts misinformation or indicted themselves? How legally responsible is this reputable person in
Yeah.
helping an applicant?
I don't honestly, I don't know the precise answer to that, but my suspicion is that is not something you have to worry about. You are, as I said, declaring to the court or informing the court that you assisted. You are not taking any role in the case beyond that. So I think the concern should be minimal,
We have another one in the chat.
which I either,
Listen,
yeah, you wanna go?
And a number change after you submit the application, for example, I have a family, that just got married here, but the woman has 2 children. So they submit the application, after that, they got the receipt with the 2 children, different A number, the A number change. Can that happen? Is that normal or?
Just to repeat for the folks online, the question is, do we ever see A numbers changing after the application is filed? I mean, unfortunately, yes, we do see that. We are talking about an enormous bureaucracy. Mistakes are made. You want to, if the person has an A number, you want to be very sure to include the A number on their 589 so that there is no confusion, right? I'm sure you did that, and a new A number was issued anyway. At some point, you're going to have to explain either to the asylum office or the immigration court, no, this is actually the same person. They just have 2 different A numbers. But we have seen many people with more than 1 A number.
But how can they prove that? How can they prove that it's the same person? So they just have the notice to appear and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's worth a follow-up conversation, because I would want to know a lot more about the documents and, you know, what is filed. But there should, first of all, fingerprints is one way they can prove it, right? But I feel like I would want to know more or be able to really comment.
thank you.
Hi, I was wondering, how long on average does it take for an asylum seeker to complete this form? Because if I had to sit down and do this and just go by, you know, places I visited recently, I have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And it's not gonna happen in one sitting.
No.
And I was wondering, have other organizations done this, and have they done it individually or in a group setting or both? And how successful has that been? Does it require more than one session? It's like, here, do your homework and come back to me in a couple of weeks. And
Sure.
so I was wondering
Yeah.
in terms of the practical.
For sure, that's a great question, and I'm gonna repeat it just because I don't know
Sure,
what the folks online heard, and I don't want to ignore them unintentionally, but the question is really, practically speaking, how long does it take to complete an asylum application, and what are the different ways different organizations what have different organizations done to best assist people? So I will tell you in my own practice, right, as somebody who's done this for years, at a bare minimum, we're talking about 2 appointments, right? You're talking about 2 appointments that are multi-hours, each maybe 2 hours long each, right? And that's me knowing what questions I'm asking, how to like really cut through and get to the like really important stuff really quickly, right? So it's not a short process, which is one reason I encourage like the use of the application in the person's language, right? Because assuming literacy in their own language, there's a lot of work that people can do on their own. So number one, we, as part of this project that I was talking about earlier, one component is what we call pro se clinics. So where we actually help people complete their application and then be able to file it for them, but we're not taking the case. In those clinics, the folks are actually given the first 4 pages before, right, in advance. Do this as best you can, right? And there's no expectation that people do it perfectly, or that it's, 100% correct, right? But at least we have a starting point. So certainly I would encourage that as a way to cut down on the workload, frankly, because it's a lot. And people, are eager to help themselves, right? And so they can, and they are perfectly capable of doing it as well.
We have one from online. Can you talk about if socioeconomic class is a particular social group, and how would you define family as a PSG?
Louise, did you hear that? Okay, so just for the interpreter, the question is, how would you, can we talk about if socioeconomic class is a particular social group? And how would we? I gotta be honest that this question is beyond the scope of this presentation. These are very interesting questions, and we can do a presentation just on particular social groups, frankly, but it is beyond the scope. Family, I'll answer the family question very briefly. It's usually defined as immediate family. So the family of Rebecca Press or the Press family is a particular social group. And so socioeconomic class generally is not. So you want to be defining it based on other things, not just class. But that's worth a much longer conversation, to be honest. All right, we have some more online, so I might take help. What time is it? We have just 4 minutes left. I figure let's answer them, right? If we're here. The next one I'm seeing, Evan, Jessica, if it's okay, is about documentation.
Yeah,
Okay, so the next question online is documentation of persecution done just before the trial / hearing? Generally, we prep our cases, I would say 6 to 8 months. We begin prepping them 6 to 8 months in advance. Some of our clients have evidence long before that, which they share with us. But generally, given the pace of cases and how many trials we have coming up, we tend to plan things 6 to 8 months in advance. And that doesn't then mean we're working on it every single day, right? It means we're meeting with our clients periodically and we're gathering the evidence over the course of a long period of time. But it's not years in advance, it's months in advance. Sorry, I'm now reading the questions online.
I think we're set with questions
Okay.
online, Rebecca.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming. We will be back in May and in June. In May, we're doing a presentation on changes of venue. So how to get that case from San Antonio to New York. And in June, a presentation on employment authorization, how to actually apply for an employment authorization once you qualify and how to figure out if you do qualify. Also for our Spanish speakers, we do a series of webinar in Spanish. I know we've had amazing interpreters here today, but we do a series in Spanish webinar so that you can access it, and all the videos are available online as well, which I'm happy to share. So great. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Oh, and if you're still here, please, we have a survey. We really want feedback. We want to know what are we doing well and what are we not doing well so that we can improve going forward. The folks online, the survey was just put in the chat. And for the folks here, we have a QR code. It's on the door, it's up here. We really appreciate your feedback so that we can do a better job. Yeah, and get the right information to the right people. So thank you very much. I'll stop here.